While Thingol and his elves of Doriath and the elves of Beleriand are to battle the Eastern Orc army, Círdan the shipwright hasn't had nearly as much luck in the west. The Orc host sends detachments to attack Thingol as they camp and plunder the region. Círdan gathers some forces to drive out the western Orc host, but his army is defeated. Overwhelmed by the number of Orcs, they are driven back until they retreat to the coastal cities of Eglarist and Brithambar. At that moment begins a long and terrible siege. Hey guys, in today's video we will start with the War of the Duel series, better known as the Wars of Beleriand, the most destructive wars Middle-earth ever experienced. Visit our channel weekly. Here we will go in depth with all the information you want to learn of Middle-earth and its amazing characters. From where does Sauron come from, to the origins of Orcs, Ents, and even follow the travels of our most beloved characters. So if you are a fan of this type of content regarding the history of Middle-earth, don't forget to subscribe for more. Also don't forget to turn on the bell notification to be notified whenever new content has been put up on our channel, Dwarfs of Khazad-dûm. These informative videos do take a long time to get together, so don't forget to comment and give a like to help the channel out. The First Battle of Beleriand was a large conflict that engulfed East and West Beleriand just before the First Age. It began shortly after Morgoth's flight from a man with the Silmarils, and ended with the return of the Noldor to Middle-earth. Now, as has been told, the power of Elwë and Melian increased in Middle-earth. And all the elves of Beleriand, from the mariners of Círdan, to the wandering hunters of the Blue Mountains beyond the river Helion, owned Elwë as their lord. Elu Thingol, he was called, King Greymantle, in the tongue of his people. They are called the Sindar, the Grey Elves of Starlit Beleriand, and although they were Morroquendi, under the lordship of Thingol and the teaching of Melian, they became the fairest and the most wise and skillful of all the elves of Middle-earth. With Melian as his spouse, Amaya, things went smoothly, and continued to do so through the 3 ages of the chaining of Melkor. And at the end of the first age of the chaining of Melkor, when all the earth had peace and the glory of Valinor was at its noon, there came into the world Luthien, the only child of Thingol and Melian. Though Middle-earth lay for the most part in the sleep of Yavanna, in Beleriand, under the power of Melian, there was life and joy, and the bright stars shone as silver fires. The second age of the chaining of Melkor marked the first interaction between elves and another species with speech, the dwarfs. This surprised the elves greatly, for they had believed themselves to be the only living things in Middle-earth that spoke with words or wrought with hands, and that all others were but birds and beasts. The dwarfs passed over the Blue Mountains into Beleriand and established cities. They came in contact with the Sindar and a friendship grew between the two races. Hailing from over the Erd Luin, they were christened differently by the elves from what they called themselves. Themselves they named Khazad, but the Sindar called them Norgrim, the stunted people, and Gonhirim, masters of stone. Far to the east were the most ancient dwellings of the Norgrim, but they had delved for themselves great halls and mansions, after the manner of their kind, in the eastern side of Erd Luin, and those cities were named in their own tongue Gabilgathul and Chumunzahar. The elves named these Belegost and Nogrod. Greatest of all the mansions of the dwarfs was Khazad-dûm, the Dwaradelf, that was afterwards in the days of its darkness called Moria, but it was far off in the mountains of mist beyond the wide leagues of Eriador, and to the Eldar came but as a name and a rumour from the words of the dwarfs of the Blue Mountains. The elves found the dwarves' speech difficult to master, though the dwarfs quickly learnt the elven tongue. Probably their predisposition to keep dwarf speech to themselves had something to do with it as well, since the elves needed only apply their will and thought to the matter for the mastery of any skill. As with the linguistics, tourism and visits were pretty one-sided. Few of the elves went ever to Nogrod and Belegost, save Eol of Nan Elmoth and Maeglin his son. The dwarfs, on the other hand, were such frequent visitors to Beleriand, they made a great road that passed under the shoulders of Mount Domed and followed the course of the river Askar, crossing Helion at Sarn Athrad, the Ford of Stones. Though dwarven friendship was more readily availed upon the Noldor in later times, since they were kindred in spirit, if not in formal thought, because of their love and reverence for all, and the gems of the Noldor they praised above all other wealth. The elves found the dwarves to be quite helpful. At the end of the second age of the chaining of Melkor, Melian, utilizing her Maya senses, advised Thingol the good times were not going to last forever. Wisely, and perhaps with a dash of vanity in the mix, he thought of building a stronghold, and contracted the dwarfs of Belegost as consultants and builders. And they gave aid and counsel, most willingly, for they were unwearied in those days and eager for new works, and though the dwarfs ever demanded a price for all that they did, whether with delight or with toil, at this time they held themselves paid. For Melian taught them much that they were eager to learn, and Thingol rewarded them with many fair pearls. These Círdan gave to him, for they were got in great number in the shallow waters about the Isle of Baelor, but the Norgrim had not before seen their like, and they held them dear. One there was as great as a dove's egg, and its sheen was as starlight on the foam of the sea, Nymphalos it was named, and the chieftain of the dwarfs of Belegost prized it above a mountain of wealth. In fact, the Norgrim labored long and gladly for Thingol, and devised for him mansions after the fashion of their people, delved deep in the earth. Seemed like a great win-win situation all around. Thingol had pearls to spare, and the Norgrim loved them, plus they got to learn from Melian. So, where the Escalduin flowed down, and parted Neldoreth from Region, there rose in the midst of the forest a rocky hill, and the river ran at its feet. There they made the gates of the hall of Thingol, and they built a bridge of stone over the river, by which alone the gates could be entered. Beyond the gates wide passages ran down to high halls and chambers far below that were hewn in the living stone, so many and so great that that dwelling was named Menegroth, the 1,000 Caves. Menegroth must indeed be a place of beauty, wrought by both elven and dwarven hands. But the elves also had part in that labor, and elves and dwarfs together, each with their own skill, they wrought out the visions of Melian, images of the wonder and beauty of Valinor beyond the sea. The pillars of Menegroth were hewn in the likeness of the beeches of Orome, stock, bough, and leaf, and they were lit with lanterns of gold. The nightingales sang there as in the gardens of Lorien, and there were fountains of silver, and basins of marble, and floors of many-coloured stones. Carven figures of beasts and birds there ran upon the walls, or climbed upon the pillars, or peered among the branches entwined with many flowers. And as the years passed, Melian and her maidens filled the halls with woven hangings, wherein could be read the deeds of the Valar, and many things that had befallen in Arda since its beginning, and shadows of things that were yet to be. That was the fairest dwelling of any king that has ever been east of the sea. And when the building of Menegroth was achieved, and there was peace in the realm of Thingol and Melian, the Norgrim yet came ever and anon over the mountains and went in traffic about the lands, but they went seldom to the Farlers, for they hated the sound of the sea and feared to look upon it. To Beleriand there came no other rumour or tidings of the world without. Perhaps their fear of the sea enhanced the value of what pearls the dwarves could procure. It is interesting that subsequently the dwarfs were the ones to tell Thingol that the Valar had not rooted out utterly the evils of the north, and now the remnant, having long multiplied in the dark, were coming forth once more and roaming far and wide. That fell beasts roamed in the land east of the mountains, and the Sindar's ancient kindred that dwell there are flying from the plains to the hills. Of the many sorts of evil creatures that marauded their way into Beleriand, perhaps the most intriguing and horrifying were the orcs, who afterwards wrought ruin in Beleriand, but they were yet few and wary, and did but smell out the ways of the land, awaiting the return of their lord. Whence they came, or what they were, the elves knew not then, thinking them perhaps to be Avari who had become evil and savage in the wild, in which they guessed all too near, it is said. So Thingol began to build an armory to equip his people, weapons the first of which the Norgrim smithered for him, for they were greatly skilled in such work, though none among them surpassed the craftsmen of Nogrod, of whom Telka the smith was greatest in renown. The dwarfs were able to craft weapons because they were an ancient race familiar with strife, who would fight fiercely against whomsoever aggrieved them, servants of Melkor, or Eldar, or Avari, or wild beasts, or not seldom their own kin, dwarfs of other mansions and lordships. While the Sindar learned their smithcraft, they could not do hack-it without the dwarfs, for in the tempering of steel alone of all crafts the dwarfs were never outmatched even by the Noldor, and in the making of mail of linked rings, which was first contrived by the smiths of Belegost, their work had no rival. What a project, but ultimately, every project ends. Finally, well equipped, the Sindar cleared out the creatures of evil, and there was peace again. After which, the weapons were stored in Thingol's armories, so well made and of such quality that they rusted not but shone ever as if they were new burnished. The peace won by the Sindar enticed some of the Nanda, their Teleri kindred, who followed Lenwë down south on the western banks of the Anduin, instead of crossing the Hitheglir with the main body of the Teleri host on the great journey. Having no weapon of steel themselves, they seek the protection of Thingol. The green elves were welcomed by Thingol, as kin long lost that return. Hearing of the power of Thingol, their king led many of his people over the Blue Mountains to Beleriand. They settled in Assyriand, renaming it Linden, in the east of Beleriand, and he became their king. They were called the Lakewendi, or Green Elves. Finally, the third age of the chaining of Melkor ended. After 3,000 years in captivity, Melkor slew the trees of the Valar with the aid of Ungoliant, and escaped to Middle-earth. The great cry of Morgoth echoed through Beleriand, and all its people shrank for fear, for though they knew not what it foreboded, they heard then the herald of death. Morgoth, as has before been told, returned to Angband, and built it anew. While the Noldor were still struggling in Aman, Morgoth had already arrived in Middle-earth well ahead of them, and quickly reoccupied his old fortress of Angband, where Sauron and Gothmog had long been breeding orcs in the darkness. Morgoth desired still to conquer and dominate the peoples of Middle-earth, and so sent forth his armies hoping to seize the territories to his south. He waited for 20 years to prepare his forces for his next invasion. The first battle for Beleriand was about to commence. The battle was fought on at least 4 different fronts: Doriath, Western Beleriand, Eastern Beleriand, and Hithlum. The battle began when Morgoth released his hordes of orcs across the lands, hoping to overwhelm the Sindarin elves, and to claim all of Beleriand for himself as a preparation for possible pursuit by the Noldor. Morgoth's forces issued forth in 2 main hosts, passing west through the Vale of Ser-Ian and east between Aros and Hilion, some of them even scaling the passes of Anak and Aglin. The orcs make camps on the Estelad Plain in the east and the Talath Plain in the west. The western host marched directly on the Falas, along the coast of Beleriand, which put them on a collision course with Círdan and his Sindar elves, who came to protect the lands west of Menegroth as the western orc host ravaged and plundered the region. Círdan the Shipwright was one of the highest and most noble of the Sindar, lord of the Philathrim during the First Age, and master of the Grey Havens through the Second, Third, and Fourth Age. He was one of the wisest and most foresighted of the elves, and by the Second Age the oldest known elf in Middle-earth. He remained so throughout that age and into the Fourth Age as well. He was also gifted Narya, one of the 3 rings by Celebrimbor, until he surrendered it to Gandalf. The western host defeated Círdan's Philathrim on the field of battle, and then laid siege to their fortified havens on the coast, the walled cities of Eglarist and Brithambar. Thingol himself was faced with a few setbacks. Detachments of both orc hosts entered the domain of Thingol, which his forces fought and held at bay. Thingol was cut off from Círdan at Eglarist, and called upon Denethor, who with his Lakewendi came in force from beyond Aros and from Assyriand. His main focus was the Eastern Orc force, which was to face off with the Green Elves of Assyriand. During the fighting it was soon evident the Green Elves were no match for the Orcs, who were shod with iron and iron-shielded and bore great spears with broad blades. Eventually, the Assyriand forces were pushed back onto Amon-Ereb, where they were cut off and surrounded. Here, Denethor and his lightly armed company made their last stand against a sea of foes. There he fell and all his nearest kin about him, before the host of Thingol could come to his aid upon the highest point in the plains. It hence had tremendous strategic importance in the War of the Jewels, as it overlooked the eastern passage around the long wall of the Andran, guarding the northern ways to Tuam Duinath. When Thingol's forces arrived, the orcs stood no chance against the well-armored Sindar, for they wore and carried the armor and weapons made by the dwarves. The orcs were utterly destroyed as Thingol's forces crashed on their rear with devastating force. Those orcs that did escape death scattered east but were slain by the dwarfs of Mount Domed. The battle was over and the armies of Thingol stood victorious over Morgoth's forces in East Beleriand. Though the elves were victorious, there was heavy casualties, and many things changed within the Lakewendi people. His people lamented their leader ever after and took no king again. After the battle some returned to Assyriand, and their tidings filled the remnant of their people with great fear, so that thereafter they came never forth in open war, but kept themselves by wariness and secrecy, and they were called the Lakewendi, the Green Elves, because of their raiment of the color of leaves. But many went north and entered the guarded realm of Thingol, and were merged with his people. And when Thingol came again to Menegroth, he learned that the Orc host in the west was victorious, and had driven Círdan to the rim of the sea. Therefore he withdrew all his people that his summons could reach within the fastness of Neldareth and region. Melian then put forth her power and fenced all in their dominion with an unseen veil of shadow and bewilderment, the girdle of Melian, that none thereafter could pass against her will or the will of Thingol, unless one should come with a power greater than that of Melian the Maya. And this inner land, which was long named Eglador, was after called Doriath, the guarded kingdom, land of the girdle. Within it there was yet a watchful peace, but without there was peril and great fear, and the servants of Morgoth roamed at will, save in the walled havens of the Farlers. Thought battle was held to be over, the cities of the havens remained under siege by the forces of the western Orc host. They were left to fend for themselves as Thingol refused to send aid after the battle. All in all, the first battle of Beleriand was a crushing defeat for Morgoth, but it came at a very heavy price for the elves. A huge portion of Beleriand had been laid to waste and the green elves of the east were decimated. At this point, now 7 years after the first battle, Fëanor, leader of the Noldor elves, had just landed in the Firth of Drengist. He burned the ships at Losgar which he stole from the Grey Elves and encamped in Mithrin. His pursuit of Morgoth was about to begin. Vengeance filled his heart with fire, he was poised to recover his precious Silmarils and avenge his father's death. No one would stand between him and the Silmarils. Not Morgoth, nor the Valar themselves. Things were about to start getting interesting. Hey friends, hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories on Middle-earth. See you soon.